Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Ty, and I will be your moderator for today's program, Controlling Cash Flow, Processes, and People Within AR, presented by Resourceful Finance Pro and sponsored by Gaviti. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the chat box in the control panel. If they're regarding the subject being presented, I'll add them to the queue for questions at the end. Now I'd like to introduce your speaker, Rebecca Gerger.
Hey Ty, thanks for that introduction, and nice to meet everybody. My name's Becca, as you see, Rebecca, I guess Gerger fully. I'm an account executive with our team here at Gaviti. Just to give you guys a sense, I actually work with hundreds of clients, and we partner with hundreds of clients internally at Gaviti to help them accelerate cash flow and actually find a type of solution that's going to really sit on top of both the outreach of their clients and deal with those internal business processes as well to really ultimately take control of their AR process, monitor their efforts, and accelerate cash flow and reduce risk for their business. So that's really kind of as well, of course, what we're going to be discussing today. Would you mind, Elon, just going to the next slide, please? Thank you. The agenda today, from a very macro level, right, just so we can kind of see where we're going to be going towards throughout the session. First, we're going to start with a quick dive into why now, why AR specifically sits at the center of conversations within the business and sits at the top of those priorities today specifically. Then we're going to dive in a little bit into the traditional approach to AR, get an understanding of the elements that are causing some of these core consequences the teams are seeing. And ultimately from that point, we're then going to talk about, kind of going to turn a page and talk about the evolution of AR, some of these strategies and best practices that we actually see companies and teams adopting to alleviate some of those negative consequences that they've seen when it comes to their cash flow, controlling their people, controlling their AR process, to move forward within their business and reduce risk alongside that throughout the end of the discussion. So why is AR important today? I think before we go into any discussion about strategy, before we go into any discussion about best practices or where we're coming from, we have to talk about why AR stands at the center, right? Working capital today more than ever matters because we have a lot of shifts within the global economy. We speak with tons of companies who tell us their clients just aren't paying the same because they themselves are going through a lot. Money today means much more than it did a few years ago in terms of having that money in pocket. Second, teams are being asked to do more with less, and that's only amplified within finance teams who are dealing with incoming sales and yet have higher targets on their back in terms of converting cash flow. And then lastly, AR teams internally within companies, we hear this a lot. I'm sure some of the people who are joining as well going through this, but there's a high rate of employee turnover within AR, and it's increasingly hard to find relevant candidates to fill those spots, especially in the United States and North America. So again, we kind of have to talk about where we've been before we talk about where we're going, and that's where we want to talk a bit about the traditional AR approach. Most companies we speak with, can probably break down their approach into three main categories when we're thinking about the way in which they're dealing with accounts receivable. First, usually they're involving sales reps. Sometimes they got the finance team, and in larger teams as well, of course, they're going to have a full-on collections team. And this is really going to be dependent on whether or not you're a startup where you're leveraging both, or whether you're kind of more of an enterprise company where you actually have a collections teams and teams that sit, within finance to deal with that. Of course, in terms of when we're reaching out to clients, the frequency at which people are reaching out to their clients when it comes to account receivable can be daily, biweekly, monthly, as well as triggered by aging, right? And that's kind of varied. And then usually in terms of how that's occurring, mostly we hear that still, even if clients who have very large ERPs, they're still sitting outside on Excel and spreadsheets when it comes to notes. Maybe they have some level of dunning in terms of automatic emails going to the clients. And then most of the actual outreach after that on aging is still manual, and prioritization as well as being done from an aging report manually, maybe per day, per week. Another thing that we know is that client behavior, and this is regardless of whether or not you have a traditional strategy or you're applying some of these best practices, we know that client behavior is not always the same. Not all clients pay in the same ways. You're going to have a group of problematic clients. You're going to have a group of strong paying clients, right? And then you also have that small group as well of clients who just need one reminder and then they're going to follow up. And we know that it's varied per industry and per company as well that we work with, how that breakup really looks. Now, before we start talking about a lot of the negative impacts of the traditional approach, we first have to obviously take into account that there are positive benefits associated with the traditional approaches towards AR. First, it's convenient. Teams know how to work out of Excel. Teams know how to work out of their ERP. They know how to manually send emails. Nobody needs to go through any change management process to do this. And second, it's controllable to a certain point. I mean, we speak with tons of teams who they say, what I've been doing in the past has been working, right? I have a manual process. I have a really strong relationship with my clients. I just know that in a year, it's not going to keep working. And so that's really, we say controllable to a certain point, to a certain threshold. And that's where we're going to kind of delve in. So what we really see is that as the volume of invoices increases, traditional methods really turn into a costly and inefficient process. What was once working simply stops working. And even if it is working to a certain point, as the company continues to bring in more sales, we're going to see that risk, it does not align with the risk that is going on when we are doing everything manually, when we're not reaching all of our clients simply because we don't have the threshold to catch up to that. Okay. So if we're taking sort of 3 steps back, again, before we can get into some of the issues, we have to dive down in causality. And the traditional approach can really be broken into 2 main components when we're thinking about how it works and what it causes. It's both manual and reactive. And those are really kind of what we're going to delve into here in a moment. When we're thinking manual, right, what we're saying here, obviously, manual meaning work is being done out of aging reports. We're deciding which clients to reach out to based on the amount due on the invoice and as well as the actual due date and aging on that. Maybe we're sending email, manual emails and spreadsheets like we mentioned. And this is both time consuming, which I think is pretty intuitive, right? People know that, but it's also misaligned, which I'd argue is even more of a cost, meaning are you even focusing on high value tasks? Teams are working extremely hard to make that happen and they're still misaligned on the outcomes. It's also reactive, okay? And when we think about reactive, this is about the fact that we're using static variables like due date of the invoice and the amount due, rather than also taking into account things like client payment behavior, industry, previous experience with our business. How does this also can also dive into better and more varied ways in which we can reach out to our clients. But instead, we're living out of static variables. Our forecasting maybe is less accurate, and we're constantly reacting to information that we could have been leveraging forwards. And that's delayed, right? When we're having a manual process like we talked about, that also means maybe you're not going to be able to reach all your clients 7 days before the due date of the invoice. You're going to have to only reach them 30 days after, simply because you don't have the right amount of you don't have enough resources to be wearing that many hats and doing that manually. And what that's going to cause is both a delayed escalation from the client and then ultimately delayed payment. So there's a number of negative outcomes typically that we see, for AR teams. And like I mentioned at the beginning, I personally partner with and speak with really hundreds of clients per month, hundreds of companies who are going through a lot of these processes, and this is very, very common. I'm going to really focus on the top 3, I think, just to be efficient and respectful of everyone's time and energy here. By far, the top issue that we hear is that people are failing to reach all their customers. If you look at the bottom there, I'm sure you probably spotted that one out. Companies approach us all the time saying, we have a manual process and we just can't get to all of our customers before the due date of the invoice. Even if they have some level of dunning, once it's overdue, they can't reach at the threshold that they'd like to get ahead of that and deal with the escalation. They're really unable to reach every client. We're also hearing a lot of times that the actual customer collaboration, getting in touch with your client includes a lot of friction. So it's hard for the clients themselves as well to get back in touch with the team, hence again, causing some of that delay that we discussed previously. And then third point that we see heavily is the lack of control over the collection process. I think that lack of control is more so focused towards teams that do have a collections team, or maybe a few, maybe 20, 30, 40 people on their collections team, where they're dealing with the fact of how do I actually completely control and monitor what are the efforts going out? How do I both monitor the efforts as well as make sure that that's aligned with the outcomes we're trying to get to. And so this is varied as well, of course, based on the industry, based on the size of the company, and where you're coming from as well in your current process. There's also a number of negative outcomes for the business. Okay, we can talk all day about AR, but we have to talk eventually about the bottom line, right? First and foremost, what we hear constantly is, I was just speaking with a client the other day, and they said, I'm not surprised that this is the issue, which is lost cash flow. At the end of the day, as much as we want to talk about efficiencies, everything is about cash flow and risk. So companies are, because they're dealing with these, traditional processes, they're both not getting in touch with their clients fast enough. They're struggling to actually follow up when the client does get in touch, and ultimately, the cash conversion cycle is longer than they'd like it to be. And that money in pocket is critical right now, specifically for companies. Another, second, usually what I hear out of this list, obviously I'm sure you guys are scanning it as well, is lower value tasks. Teams struggle to figure out which tasks, especially if they're in a manual environment, what are the tasks that my collectors are going to be doing per day or my finance professionals need to do per day that are going to actually affect an outcome of the cash flow? Not just random reach out to this client. Are you reaching out to the problematic clients versus the clients who are eventually going to pay? How are you making those decisions? Have we actually focused on high value, high impact tasks? Okay. And then last is inaccurate forecasting. Really, this is for larger companies. It's very hard for them to get that. And I'm sure there's some people here who are experiencing this too. We hear a lot of times that it's very, very hard to get that accurate and specific roll up for forecasting when we're not taking into account dynamic factors, when we're not taking into account client payment behavior, when we're not scoring them and prioritizing when we can expect to see amounts of money coming in based off of the information that we're getting per day on our interactions internally. And that creates a lot of missed opportunity for the business. So let's turn a page. We talked a lot about the negative, but let's talk about what people are doing, right? In the past, what we've seen is a very traditional process, and what we're starting to see is that teams are adopting overarching strategies to actually accelerate their cash flow and take control of what they're doing. And this type of strategy is going to really focus on proactive versus reactive decision making, figuring out what are the most competitive payment terms that are better performing, what are the type of client groups and how we should reach out to them, and what is going to change the way in which, change and accelerate the cash conversion cycle in that process. It's also focused on precision in terms of focusing on high value tasks. We are being specific about our efforts and efficient so that when possible, we're making sure that whatever we are doing manually or whatever outreach we are doing is going to have an outcome that's desired from the business. It's also control, okay? It's gonna have a strategy that stands behind the outreach to the client. It's not gonna be randomized. We're gonna make sure that for this client group, there's this specific outreach, different client groups, we're segmenting them correctly so that we actually control the outreach that we have internally to our clients and the outcomes that we're getting. And then it also, I think visible and data-driven we could probably put together, but it's highly valuing visibility and data-driven decision-making. So when you have more visibility into the client and invoice information and the history, you're also able to make more data-driven decisions and drive deeper into the information as to how you're going to take action on those clients and as well as on different, whether it's, product offerings and seeing how competitive those are versus, how that aligns with your KPIs, making those data-driven decisions forward for the business and offering up additional value from finance, let's say to sales or to product, to continue moving the ball forward. The core benefits of applying an AR strategy, I guess you could break it up into two main categories, right? A lot of people ask me, again, what's the bottom line here about what people see when they do apply these practices? First, it's going to accelerate your cash flow. It's going to do this by enabling your team to reach all of the customers. Okay, again, can't tell you how many teams we speak to who just say, I can't reach my tail end customers. It's going to allow teams to preemptively escalate. Getting in touch at DSO 0 just means much more than getting in touch at DSO 30. So the client can also, your team can internally deal with that issue and the client will pay sooner rather than later because that issue has been dealt with. And then it's also going to reduce customer friction. And all of that together, whether it's enhancing the communication capacity from the client, preemptively escalating and reach out on your clients, will actually reduce that cash conversion cycle. And then maximizing productivity, again, I think we take this back to really the team efforts internally. It's going to enable us to collaborate and align internally. Information means nothing unless it's in context, and especially unless everybody can see it. We're going to allow us to, monitor team execution. We speak with a lot of companies, especially enterprise level companies, that just struggle to see what people are doing so that they can figure out what is it that they're doing that is working or not, right? We need to be monitoring that. And then ultimately, we want to be controlling our outcomes from that. And all three of those elements are going to help us maximize productivity alongside accelerating cash flow as a business. And really, we can break best practices down, I think, into 6 main categories, right? And in a moment, we're going to go and delve into a couple of, let's say, practical applications here. But let's kind of take, again, 3 steps back and view this. First, automate where possible, right? We know this, but anytime we can automate a process, if it is, and allow a team to focus more on high-value tasks, that's what we want to be doing. We want to be segmenting client groups, segmenting different types of approaches to different client groups based on their behavior, based on their industry, so on and so forth. We want to centralize data. We want to communicate, whether it's internally or externally with the client. We want to streamline business processes. You obviously have the outreach to the client, but you have that whole follow-up process we want to be focusing on as well. And we want to be able to streamline those additional escalations, disputes, so on and so forth. And we want to execute. Strategy means nothing without execution. If we simply have a strategy, but we do not have a way of executing and monitoring that, ultimately, we're left with goals without any types of specific markers as to how we're getting there. And so, a couple of, again, kind of going to take a couple steps forward now. People always ask me, what are the things that we can be applying? And whether or not this is via Gaviti, okay, or via, a way internally as to how you're trying to apply these best practices, here's a few things that we see people doing. So first, centralize real-time KPIs, okay? You want to get everything on the same dashboard to figure out total AR, DSO, and some teams are already doing this internally, right? Maybe out of Power BI, but it's taking a lot of manipulation of data. And a lot of that is because the process is manual. So when they're looking at their forecast, hey, how do I take into promise to pay and project it? How am I actually taking into those additional factors beyond just amount due and due date of the invoice? They're having to do a lot of manual manipulation to get all this information. So you want to have the information at the tip of your fingertips. You also want to be able to leverage behavior-driven forecasts. So like we started to talk about, your forecasting can't only be based out of static information like the due date of the invoice and the amount due. We need to also be able to take into account client payment behavior. We need to be scoring our clients and drawing insights as to what that means for our cash flow. We also need to be taking into account promise to pay. We all know that it's very hard to roll up promise to pay as well internally. So we need to be taking into account all the information that we possibly can, that we are constantly collecting internally in our engagement with our clients to have a much more accurate forecast. Another best practice that we see, and again, I think this is really common, but we need to talk about it, is automation. Typically, best practices that we see is that people want to be leveraging some type of workflow, usually a workflow based off of the due date of the invoice. And if you can get to a point where you're also able to add customization and personalization, such as tweaking the wording per step, choosing the attachments on each step, making sure that you're able to choose internally from whom this email goes to and externally who it gets to on the client side, you're obviously going to also make sure that the client opens that email, engages with it, gets back in touch with your team, and escalates if needed, to make sure that that action, that cash conversion cycle is reduced. But the high level here is we want to be leveraging automation to reach all of our clients in a meaningful way. And then, to take that a step further, you also want to be able to usually personalize your outreach as well by segmenting client groups. Okay, this would mean segmenting client groups, maybe based off of having a different automated workflow for strategic clients. Maybe you have different automation for high-risk clients. I'm sure you guys, if there's anyone from Europe, maybe you want to have low-touch workflows with some of your clients where instead of emailing, you're calling them more. But you're going to have a combination of all that based on the way in which you want to reach out to your different client groups. And that also means that internally in your workflows as well, you want to have ways to streamline internal escalation. So for example, if there's an invoice dispute, triggering actions right when that's identified within the system as a dispute to trigger an email over to the logistics manager in this example. If there's some sort of dispute internally, a question of the client that needs to go to customer success or customer service, trigger that straight over. Again, how can we also streamline that second step as to once you do get in touch with the clients, when they get back in touch with you, making sure as well that the information is going to the right people so that we can, as quickly as possible, get back to the client so that they will indeed pay that invoice and settle that dispute. Another thing that we see teams trying to do is prioritize high impact tasks. Now, I will say, I personally spoke with a company very recently that said they had their management team spent a lot of overhead time dealing with just prioritizing tasks for the collections teams. And that also occurs internally on smaller teams, on lean teams, where they're going through an aging report and having to choose between what is my task going to be every day. And there is an opportunity cost to what you choose to do per day if you're wearing a lot of hats. So on both ends, we're losing if things aren't prioritized correctly. So we want to have ways and thresholds within our workflows, as well as different note sections where we can actually prioritize high impact tasks and have them automatically populate into some sort of actions calendar task view or a task list per day. And then another type of thing, and this is going to be dependent on how large your team is, full transparency, but once teams get to a certain point, they need to be able to monitor the team output. Again, like when we talk about execution, you need to make sure that what is it that your team is actually doing, and you have to know what is the team output before you can figure out what the outcomes are and how they connect to what you're doing in your strategy and whether it's working. So I want to be able to see, for example, can I figure out whether my collectors have what touch points they've had with the clients, which notes they've added, which calls they've made, and when that occurred. Okay, so I want to be able to monitor at each point throughout the system what's going on internally from our end as well, and from the finance team to understand how to continue to improve that. And we also, when we're reaching out to the client, beyond just the internal processes, the actual communication to the client, we want to make sure that when we get feedback back from them, we're able to communicate that back to our team in context. So for example, if there's a promise to pay, let's say your team's on the phone, we find this all the time that it's very hard to get promise to pay rolled up to forecasting. So this is going to require, we want to make sure that when you have a promise to pay, best practice is to put a specific date that will roll up for forecasting, but also to add reminders and notes from that promise to pay note so that collector can remember on, I guess in this example, September 14th to send themselves a task reminder to call the client or review the account to make sure that did indeed happen before the client, before that promise to pay is up. Okay. And so ultimately we need to be communicating in context with our goals. We also want to be able to unify client and invoice history. This really means that when somebody on your team needs to figure out, you're on the phone with a client, you want to make sure that you have all the information and the most up-to-date information when you're speaking with a client so that you have a meaningful, educated conversation. And what this is going to do is both allow your team to be more effective throughout their conversations with the client, but also to be able to flag scenarios. Like if there's been a bounce in one of the emails sent from the workflow, you need to know that. If there's been some sort of reply from the client back to the workflow email, it needs to roll up at the customer and invoice level history. So again, everybody can be on the same page as they're acting towards the client or reviewing the client if they're flagging something internally. And that also means, we talk a lot about AR and finance team, but everybody knows that sales, logistics, depending on your industry, there are other stakeholders that get involved. So we also want to be able to collaborate and facilitate basically cross team communication. So anytime I'm adding a note or taking action, I should be able to tag others in my actual notes internally inside Gaviti. And this note, for example, let's say Leon is my sales rep. He's not in finance. When he gets a note from Gaviti or from a system when I'm tagging, it shouldn't be that he has to go into Gaviti to see it, right? A lot of people ask me, okay, this is great, but I want to make sure that, Leon is a sales rep. He lives out of Salesforce. So he should be able to get that reminder sent straight to his email address with all the information that he needs to see so that he can take action straight from that email, that he doesn't need to go into Gaviti or into everything needs to be streamlined so that we're actually following up as well internally with less friction if we're passing this in between tasks from team to team. And I guess on the team of, the wording of friction, this is perfect. We also need to be reducing client correspondence friction. A lot of teams we speak with say that it's hard for their clients themselves to reach back to them. and we know this, maybe they are emailing back to your team and it's going to some sort of centralized email address, but who's going to get to it and when, right? So we want to be able to make it easy for the client themselves as well to have a self-service portal where they can view themselves through their own email reminders. Maybe they have a portal where it could take them to see the specific invoice, how much is due, where they can download the PDF of the invoice, where they can communicate with your team. If they have a promise to pay, they can send your team a promise to pay date. They can send a message, upload proof of payment, as well as pay. We want to make this as easy and service-oriented as possible for the client as well to take action if they do have a question, so you guys can internally deal with that. And that also means, of course, having a client-facing self-service portal. We hear this more and more within the field that it's not only enough anymore to have great service, but it has to be easy for your client to get in touch with you. They want to be in control as well, right? So we have a client, what we typically see teams trying to do is have some sort of client-facing portal where they're going to be able to have all of the invoices, where the client themselves can also download each PDF of the invoice. Per invoice, they're able to send a message, send a promise to pay, even view the invoice history, the back and forth with your team in context for what they need to be doing, as well as the AP team. And so in conclusion, I know we went through kind of a lot of steps, both when we talk about that internal process as well as the external outreach to the client, but ultimately what we're trying to do is apply an overarching strategy for AR. And like we talked about throughout this discussion, first, we know that AR and cash flow sits at the center. It is now a central issue for businesses to have working capital more than it was in the past. And what that's brought about is this conversation as to why the traditional approach, the traditional manual approaches, especially to AR, are becoming increasingly costly to businesses as they start to look to accelerate their cash conversion cycle. And so what we did was, throughout our conversation, we then talked about, of course, kind of this evolution that we're seeing within AR, and we went over a couple of best practices from a very high level. And I'm going to kind of close that off here. I would like to open it up for questions. I'm sure that I can already preempt, usually people kind of at this point say, so how does Gaviti connect to this? As you guys saw, we do help teams do that. A lot of the focus for us is how can we apply an overarching strategy and help teams apply these best practices in a way in which is going to help their business reach the goals that they're trying to do if they are coming from a traditional strategy. I'm going to open this up now. I think, Ty, if you'd like to, I'm going to hand this over to Ty to continue the conversation.
Thank you, Rebecca. And now we would like to take your questions. So if you have questions, please submit them into the chat box. And first, we'll get to the questions that came in via email. Then I'll turn to the chat. Our first question is, if our staff is resistant to moving to automation solutions, how do we change their mindset?
That's a great question. I think I get that a lot. I would take that back. When I speak with companies, there's really two main answers to that, right? First is when we realize how simple it is to adopt something like this, and in the cost in which, if we can kind of define what is our cash flow today and where we want to go, and how simple it is to adopt some sort of strategy to do this, that's where we can really start to add value to the conversation, if there is resistance. The second thing, I think, without getting too expansive here, right? What you probably need to know is that Gaviti itself, like as a company, our story is that we came from, Gaviti actually stands for, it means to collect in Hebrew. Our CEO, he was a finance manager at a high growth company in Israel where they tried to build out their own processes. A lot of teams will run into, I guess you could call it friction internally if they try to find a third-party software where the IT team will say, no, we can set up some level of dunning, it'll be fine. And it's not fine. Because what happens is, and this is usually when companies approach this as well, Gaviti as a company started because they attempted to use dunning on top of their ERP. They, the internal discussion around build or buy ultimately first lost because they built out some level of dunning that simply did not align with the whole business process as is AR. So something that we work on heavily with clients or partners that are looking to adopt some level of automation strategy is, how can we really make sure to communicate this internally that accounts receivable is far beyond simply dunning. It is far beyond just automation. It's about a business process. It's about streamlining the internal follow-up. It is a highly costly business process to execute incorrectly. And so when we can actually align where the company is looking to go in relation to what is the process, what do we have, what is out there, and why maybe some simple layer of dunning or some simple layer of notes inside the ERP still aren't going to be enough, that's really when we start to see companies help combat some of those, I guess you could call it the internal resistance to looking towards a third-party software for this. I personally can say that I've kind of, it depends on the size of the company, but we absolutely hear those questions constantly, and I appreciate that question because it is important to bring up and important to kind of align with how that conversation goes usually.
Thank you. And our next question is, many of our clients are based out of different regions and countries. Is there a way to tailor automation per country, language, and region, and not just based on risk score, strategic clients, etc.?
That's a great question. That's critical. Absolutely. I think so. I don't know if you guys remember that slide, the workflow slide, but something that we do here at Gaviti, at least in a best practice, is to also segment client groups based off of their region or languages and so on and so forth. We know this. I'm sure any international company knows this, that reaching out to a client in Germany about their invoice versus how you're going to reach out to, let's say, an Israeli client or a client in the United States is going to be different, both in terms of the language that you're going to use, but also in terms of the touch points. So yes, inside Gaviti, we focus heavily on controlling both each work. You basically have an unlimited amount of workflows, and the reasoning behind that, people ask me why, is because you want to be able to control for having not just different workflows or different risk groups, but also different workflows for high-risk German clients versus low-risk German clients. Different languages. You want to be able to also control, and we have ways to control the hours that those workflows are active, and even you can get as simple, as specific as setting what's the frequency of touch points per day that you're sending to that client. If you want to limit it to one time per day versus, and again, a lot of this is going to both. I think that the direction of that question is critical, right? Because this is about having an appropriate outreach to your clients. And if you are working in an international team, we have a lot of clients who have international, who have sell their products in international markets. They have to be able to have the right type of language outreach strategy with different client groups, and which is why they have different workflows for that as well. Appreciate that question.
Thanks, Rebecca. And there were a few people that asked this question. How long does it take to get the automation solution in place?
Yeah, that's a critical question. Obviously, when we think about time, when we think about any type of system, we have to wonder how long it's going to take to set up. So what we like to see here at Gaviti is something that is supposed to make things simpler should not be complicated to set up. So actually at Gaviti, the process of onboarding Gaviti typically takes a total of 4 to 6 meetings from kickoff to go live. A lot of the reasoning behind that, people always hear that and they say, how's that possible? Because a lot of other softwares in the field will require maybe half a year. Maybe they have to do some sort of coding up to the ERP. There's a whole process internally that sometimes needs to happen. With Gaviti, we need limited IT resources. And the reasoning behind that is that in order to set up Gaviti and get it started, we have customer success managers who help the team actually just schedule reports, usually out of the ERP. We can connect to any ERP because we don't require coding, and rapidly set up and get onboarded so that our clients themselves are able to start leveraging the software as quickly as possible so they can reduce the DSO drastically as quickly as possible, because the risk only continues to go up as you wait and wait to onboard and implement a solution.
Thank you. And our next question is, cash flow is not our main concern because our clients always pay eventually. What would be the added value in implementing a third-party software like Gaviti in our case?
First of all, whoever asked that question, I love that question. That is actually very aligned with what I hear. And I think I can already assume this is a company that, I guess you have two separate categories of companies, right? Usually I'll have companies that say, I have a major cash flow issue. And then you have the others that say, I don't have an issue with that cash flow. Maybe I'm a larger company, maybe it's more about just controlling my people, right? And that's the second side of this. Even if, first of all, I'll kind of break this into two sides. If cash flow is not your main issue, if you're saying clients are paying eventually, still doesn't mean that the money that they're going to pay eventually means as much to you as if they pay tomorrow, or faster. So what does accelerating your cash conversion cycle mean for the money that you could have in pocket for applying to other business initiatives, whether it's accelerating your product, whether it's hiring more sales reps, whatever it is, what does that actually mean in terms of time and that time element? But the second piece, I do sometimes speak with teams who say, my company is so large that this isn't about that. This is about controlling people. This is about monitoring my team. And that's also important, right? How do you actually know that the direction that your ship is facing is going actually towards your target? And if you have a large ship and you're not monitoring that, you could end up, instead of ending up in Miami, like end up in New York, right? And that's what we see in a lot of large businesses where they do have expansive AR teams, and still they're struggling to monitor their people and make sure that they're focusing on high value tasks. They're struggling to align a strategy. And so when it comes to whether I'm going to hire 10 more collectors versus 3 more, I still don't even know if what I was doing with my existing collectors is indeed reaching towards my target. And these types of things can get misaligned very, very heavily within the business. So when you ask about what's the value of something like Gaviti in that environment, number one, it's going to be about focusing on high value tasks. It's going to be about figuring out how much headcount do you actually need. And that also means for growing lean teams, right? Is this just about giving the money eventually, or is this about getting the money faster? And also, is this about hiring another 3 collectors if you grow 200% in the year, or is this also about hiring 1 collector instead of 3? And what does that mean for your business to have that additional money in hand from both angles, whether it's accelerating the cash flow or maintaining a lean team? So I guess you can kind of break that grid up based on how large your company is, but the value still sits heavily within that efficiency side and productivity when we think about the additional value add beyond cash flow.
Great, thank you. That's actually a great segue into the next question. Our team has reviewed numerous AR management software and found them all more or less the same. What makes Gaviti different from what I've already seen?
That's a great, again, I don't mean to sound like a broken record, but I'm really enjoying these questions because I think that hits the nail on the head. What makes Gaviti different, right? I guess I would break that into 3 different categories. First, we already touched on one of them, but because Gaviti doesn't require some level of coding to set up, we're able to have a rapid, easy, and simple onboarding process. What that's going to allow is, number one, an easier justification internally to actually find a tool. So you're not going to be caught up with IT saying, we can't do this because it's too complicated. No, you're going to actually be able to implement something, which is obviously, even just getting it off the ground sometimes with a lot of these other software providers is very, very hard and limiting. Second, the differences as well are in personalization. As much as we have to go into everything assuming that this isn't about putting a team into a box about this is how you should reach out to your clients. This is about teams themselves saying, here's my process. Can we customize for this? And we want to make sure that we can actually personalize and customize in every way, whether it's customizing a language, whether it's customizing the filters, whether it's customizing fields and having different integrations for different systems to make sure that it's all centralized in one place. We're actually able to focus heavily on customizations within Gaviti, which allows us to work with many different types of industries as opposed to a lot of other software providers in this field who maybe kind of struggle with that because they do have more rigid workflows or limited workflow steps or limited languages. Gaviti was very much designed out of the need for personalizing and easy, let's call it tweakability and customization within the tool for a finance team to both own and be able to change over time and have aligned with their existing process. And then the third differentiator is really focused around, it's really heavily focused around actually usability from the finance team and collaboration. A lot of teams they are going to have a tool where it's going to give them maybe some level of KPIs, but still in terms of working within the tool, it's hard to figure out what do I need to do per day. And it's hard for the general user to know how they can focus on high impact tasks. So another differentiator within Gaviti is it's very much organized to be easy for users, easy for collectors to go in, have a calendar task view and figure out what do I need to do per day, and actually take action and add notes and tag whoever they need to within the system in the same action. So when I'm adding a note, can I also tag a sales rep at the same time instead of needing to go to a new screen? I don't want to delve too deep into that because I think it's more, feature oriented, but it makes a big difference in terms of user adoption and change management when we are adopting some type of tool like Gaviti or any other type of AR platform. It needs to be easy to learn, use, adopt, and share information from one screen. And that's another differentiator for us. But high level though, I think we have to say it matters on the use case as well. And I think that we of course welcome follow-up questions about that because there's additional per use case, whether it's trucking transportation versus technology, there's going to be additional differentiators that kind of come up as to why Gaviti would be more competitive in this area or not. So, but that's kind of the general top three that we typically find ourselves discussing.
Perfect. Thank you. And now we will get to the questions in the chat. What types of companies does Gaviti fit best?
Yeah, I guess that's a great question. That probably segued from the last answer, right? The types of companies that Gaviti usually, I guess I could break this up into both use case and then industry. In terms of the use case, the companies that usually fit Gaviti are those who have higher volumes of invoices, especially if you have more than one invoice per client. Companies, imagine, and usually that touches on, it can be in any different industry that has that type of model, B2B, right? We're thinking, think trucking transportation, think logistics, think manufacturing, think technology, SaaS. If you have, with SaaS it'd be more if you have like mid-sized businesses who you do have terms with, right? As opposed to those being with credit cards. But ultimately you're gonna have higher or increasing volumes of clients that you're invoicing with terms. Another type of different, I guess, specific qualification in terms of a fit for Gaviti would be companies that are going through growth. Those who, again, when we talk about have an existing process that they know isn't going to keep working within the next year as they continue to scale up, that's going to be a really heavy alignment with what we do here. There will be a lot of maybe short-term solutions that exist to work for a short amount of time, but we heavily focus on future-proofing everything to give unlimited workflows, unlimited custom fields, unlimited languages, so that everything is able to be tweaked, so that a company who is going through growth can both apply a strategy and tweak that. And so for me, when I hear a company say, within the next year, we expect to continue to expand or bring in more sales, this is kind of how those two pieces together with high volume invoices as well as growth usually is the type of company that we would work with and start a conversation with.
Great, thank you. And the next question is, what is the difference between the dunning automation we do using our ERP and the automation strategy you presented?
That's a really powerful question. I can hear the underlying tones to that, right? Probably you've tried some level of dunning. You're familiar with that there is ERP dunning, but like, what's the difference here? I'm gonna start, I guess, I would probably answer that with a little bit of background, because this directly is kind of how we started as a company. Our CEO, excuse me, his name is Jan. He was actually an AR manager at a high growth company here in Israel, where, like, I think we started to talk about it during the discussion, but they basically had one of these larger ERPs where they tried to use dunning. Now, what we know about dunning is that it's great in terms of having some level of touch point to the client, but what we typically see is that it has its limitations. And Gaviti does not at all compete with, we don't compete with ERPs. ERPs do exactly what they're supposed to do, and dunning is just a module on top of that. But there's a full AR business process that sits aside that, far beyond just reaching out to the client with some automatic, maybe uniform email. So the differences about dunning versus something like Gaviti is that typically we see that, and this is also in our roots, when Jan's company attempted to use dunning, what they found was that they really struggled to get the level of personalization that they needed. They weren't able to segment different client groups. When it came to dispute management, when it came to credit request management, all of those additional escalation pieces internally, also once clients got in touch with them, there were no streamlined processes as well. So the differences are really focused on the fact that something that like Gaviti, that's an AR management platform, is to enable you to both apply best practices in terms of your outreach to the clients and have the right type of personalization, as well as the internal processes, whether it's dispute management, credit management, internal notes escalations, following up with the client, everything that has to do with that full-on process that is indeed the side of accounts receivable, and that does include lots of stakeholders internally as well. We're going to sit on top of fully so that nobody's sitting outside on spreadsheets, because that is what still happens in Dunning, right? People are still living in the ERP a lot of times, still struggling to get the promise to pay notes in the right way. Forecasting is still manual because the notes are sporadically dispersed. So we want to be able to have something that's all in one for the whole process and not just part of the process. And that's really where the differences lie from those two domains.
Thank you for that. And the attendee said thank you with 2 exclamation points. So I think you nailed that one. And our next question reads, our company is already tracking KPIs on a centralized dashboard customized specifically to our needs. What are the metrics / KPIs that a system like Gaviti can help analyze that my team is not already tracking ourselves?
That's a great question. I think that's valuable as well for the whole group here. I know we talked a little bit in the discussion around static versus dynamic fields, but this is where that comes in. A lot of teams, when they are doing some type of KPI tracking, it's based off of those static fields like due date of the invoice and amount due, but it oftentimes fails to take into consideration the actual payment behavior of the client, or ranking the clients against each other, or segmenting the clients into different groups and taking into account as well the payment terms. Like, we can take into account to a certain level and aggregate the data, but also how long is it taking you if you are trying to bring in those behaviors into account? Do you have a whole person doing that week by week manually? I mean, and so something that Gaviti is doing beyond just bringing in general the dry KPIs is we're actually leveraging also our understanding of the clients themselves, their payment behaviors, a non-static information, a non-static score, and we're giving each client an actual score per client that's constantly changing, that we're bringing into forecasting and bringing into our KPIs. That also means giving insights in terms of what are the most high value tasks that your team is doing? What could you be doing differently? Are you focusing on if you focus on this group of clients, what's the outcome going to be? So it's even taking it beyond that. Because we're digging so deep into data-driven insights within Gaviti and actually contextualizing it directly for the efforts of the AR team, we can prescribe proactive strategies to continue to improve the outcomes, as opposed to simply sit and look at the KPI as to where do we stand today, and then a week from now, where do we stand today? This is about where do we stand and where could we stand and what could we do to change it? And what are the additional dimensions that we might be missing out on measuring because it's so manual, to bring in additional dynamic fields to understand better how to both review the information in our KPIs, but also how to improve our KPIs. And so those are some of the differences. I don't want to go too deep into it, but we of course have algorithms to do that, and people are leveraging that heavily. And people are starting to view that as a best practice. I'm sure the person who asked that probably has started to do that internally. But again, there's also the difference of how long does that take you to do it, right? And do you have the aggregate information at hand? I would probably have to ask a few more questions to understand if your process today is manual, or if you guys have some level, how that's working internally to figure out where we're coming from and where you'd be going in relation to the differences of your KPI dashboard today.
Thanks, Rebecca. And there are a few more questions here, and it looks like I'm trying to organize them because it's a lot. It's around teams. Sales teams want things now. IT can't necessarily build things now. So so with that in mind, our team struggles to get IT on board with implementing new products. How do teams usually navigate this when they start to look at solutions like Gaviti?
So you'd have to that's a critical question, right? Because oftentimes we find that finance really struggles to get the type of attention internally to onboard new tools. And the reasoning behind that, right? It's very easy for sales because they're revenue generating side of the business. But what about IT? What about both? I'm sure IT as well struggles, and AR. They're viewed as these cost centers for the business. So how do we actually make sure to justify that and get IT on board as well, so that they're not going to say, I'm completely spread out on resources, I can't do this now. Number one, what we usually like to do is actually talk about the onboarding timeline. Again, one of the differentiators with the Gaviti is we only need 4 to 6 meetings. Usually 2 of those are setting up and scheduling reports. Something that you want to be doing, and this would be best practice, right, is gauging and making sure that is the software that you're looking at going to require coding. If it's not, then you're going to have less IT involvement. Also, when it comes to maintenance, making sure that you're able to ask those questions in the upfront conversation with whatever sales rep you're working with, so that you have that when the IT team asks you, and this is how we usually navigate this when we partner with the company, is having that information up front, empowering the finance team to go to IT and say, this is what I'm going to need. This is this amount. Here's where you might need to be involved. You can help me maybe schedule this report, but this is the scope of that. This is 1 to 2 meetings. And having that full onboarding timeline in advance, having that information will empower you to kind of navigate around that. And as much as I'd like to say that I can provide the information that is going to solve it, it also depends on how does your company view digital transformation? What is this about? Because this is all, if this is also about aligning this with a business objective, then that priority, you're going to get corporate sponsorship to make sure that you're going to have the resources. But really, it's about making sure that when we talk with teams, we focus heavily on the fact that you're not going to need coding to connect with Gaviti. This is a simple process. This is a not very, very low level of technical. I mean, it's as simple as scheduling a report. We have a lot of finance teams who know how to schedule their own aging report, hence they can schedule the customer and invoice report coming through. So making sure to be able to, we focus heavily in that question around making sure we're able to communicate, whether it's to IT or whether it's to management, that this is not going to require a high time frame, a large time frame and extra time from the IT team to be able to set up internally, which is what enables us to start working with and partnering with clients quickly and then in both a respectful way mutually, so that it doesn't drain the company as they're onboarding by the time the thing gets set up. We want to make something that's supposed to make things more simple to set up.
Perfect. And this question's kind of on the other side of that, and you did allude to the solution for it, but what would you say to an IT department who argues that they can build out and tailor an AR management solution on their own rather than purchasing a third-party software?
I love that question. Whoever asked that, thank you. I think I don't know if you guys know, you'll probably see my profile. I'm originally from the US, but I live in Israel. Israel, we have a very deep development culture. So any company you go to or any company you work for wants to build everything out on their own first. So an IT team who typically is saying that, or a development team is saying, yeah, we can build that, no problem. You'd probably want to just follow up with questions. I wouldn't even give the answer. It can ask the questions that come through immediately. Do you want to maintain this? What if I need to tweak something? Do you really want me to have to open a ticket to do that? Is that something that is towards the roadmap of our business, or is it taking away from the things that we could be doing instead? IT could be focusing instead on other priorities as opposed to tweaking my system. The bottom line of it is that third-party softwares as a whole, whether it's a CRM, whether it's something like Gaviti that helps AR management teams, we wouldn't exist in the market if it was easy for all internal IT teams to develop their own. The build or buy conversation a lot of times comes from this. Again, I can relate directly because I've also come from kind of different angles. And I mean, Gaviti itself started as a build or buy argument, right? They started building out Gaviti because the company said, let's try to build something out. They couldn't find anything in the market that was suitable, and so internally tried to build it. It became such a hassle. They said, nobody should have to do this again. Let's build this out fully and take it to market. I mean, that's the extent to which we can relate to that question. So yeah, you probably want to ask questions to your IT team, like first coming at it with, here's the best practices that I need to see happen. Do you really want to build out a full management platform for me? Are you able to? Does this align with our roadmap? Because if it doesn't, whatever I'm going to get is probably going to be less than that. And that's really what we see. We do have a lot of companies who approach us who have tried internally to build some level on top of their ERP that's going to help, like they call it like a dunning module plus some type of note sections. And it's still not enough, because when they pivot as a company, or when they take on a new product, or when they start to work with another market, they have to go and open a ticket with IT every time they need to tweak any little thing in the system. So does finance really also want to have to not own their own tool, right? And I think that's really the bottom line of it. The rest is in the background. I mean, how much money is what are the billable hours that your team is going to have to put into building and developing this fully if you do want the best product in place for AR management? And is this really going to encompass your needs, or is it going to solve part of the issue and continue to perpetuate other issues within the team if it's still not fully drawn out? So that's definitely, again, I think that's very dependent on the company itself as well. Is this a tech company? Is this a manufacturing business? Are you guys going through that conversation internally? But we always come to the same conclusion, and we ourselves, as the identity of our company, are the conclusion of that, which is it's extremely draining on the business. And this is something that if you can be buying something of people who have already built this out, who have experience with applying best practices in a software that's built specifically for this, why not use your resources in another direction and then let us maintain that side of it. Let us have everything built out so that finance can own this and have fully a system that will encompass their whole process as opposed to a part of that.
Thanks, Rebecca. And we'll get to 2 more questions, and then for the overflow, we'll offline those via email. So our next question is, it's hard for our team to engage sales within the process of collections. In your experience, how are other companies dealing with this?
As a sales rep, first of all, I have to apologize on behalf of all of us. I know it's very hard to get everybody involved, especially because they're constantly running between meeting to meeting, and it's very hard to escalate. Usually what I'll see is, I kind of break this up into 2 categories. A lot of times I hear companies saying, it's really hard to get sales involved because sales, right when they get some sort of escalation, even if it's manually or sent via email, they're going to ask, what's the history on this? And then you're going to say, hey, go into Gaviti, and they're not going to want to go in, right? So the way that we help navigate that is best practices to inside any type of internal escalation email. You're going to want to tag all the information, give them all the invoice activity straight into the email. So they're not even have to click past their email to see the updated activity history internally. So that they call the client and say, hey, I saw that Becca reached out. Yes, I have all this here. And it's just no question. Number one, you don't want to have to, and that's really key to this. If you're going to have, whether it's sales or logistics or whoever it is, you want to make sure to have ways so that your internal escalation steps have enough meat and information in that step straight to the email of whoever needs to, deal with that escalation and get back to you, that they're able to take action. And then obviously number 2 is where they're going to update the notes. Same thing, same issue. Make it so that when you can ask them to update inside Salesforce, and we can come in. Usually what we do to help with this is sales teams usually live in something like Salesforce or HubSpot or whatever it is. Just you can pull the notes section as a custom field into Gaviti and be updated when they update that notes section. So as opposed to asking them to go into a different system, you're just saying, hey, please just update the note there, or you can see their reply via email and it'll show up at the invoice and customer level. Both ways work, but again, we want to make it, you want to reduce the friction. I know we talked a lot about friction with the client, but this also means internally reduce friction, especially with sales, for them to see all the information they need to see, not continue to reach out to your collections team because that's going to create more manual work if they have to keep adding history. So make sure that's just automatically tagged in the workflow email. Trigger that over with all of the history they need to see, have it set up so that everybody's taking action quickly and updating in the type of system they're familiar with, and then we can pull that back in Gaviti. Those are the ways that we usually help teams reduce the friction when it comes to also getting sales involved and actually making it help, as opposed to requiring a whole other level of internal back and forth to get them to make that action, because all of us are busy, and the salesperson themselves is going to be really, really oriented towards, I want to make sure I'm getting in touch with my client in context. So you want to be able to provide that up front.
Great. And our last question is, my company has numerous ERPs and subsidiary companies engaging in their own AR process. What are other teams doing to unify these efforts at a parent level?
So something that, I actually speak with a lot of companies who have that model where they're going to have subsidiary companies working and then a parent company at the top. Something that we do, and I think this is unique for us because we're able to connect via data file transfer, is we can actually connect with more than one. Usually what we'd recommend is to have some sort of parent entity inside Gaviti and then have your different entities per, business, but having the roll up from all those different ERPs together in one place. We're able to facilitate that even from 20 different ERPs, if it's just because ultimately you can just schedule a report out of an ERP and then have the customer invoice data coming through into a system like Gaviti. So what we would recommend is to have, I would have to hear a little bit more about your use case. Like if you're looking to unify all that in one view, you can have a parent, or you can also have different entities per ERP that you're working with if it's different business units. But the best practice would be to have that rolling up into one system like Gaviti, and then having the visibility across each account as well. And you're able to aggregate that data in one place with the files, and then have the different actions and internal notes and visibility into the account and invoice view from one place, and your KPIs rolling up all together at a parent entity level.
Thank you, Rebecca. And again, in order to remain on schedule, we'll respond to the overflow of questions that came in via email in a timely manner. With that, I'd like to thank everyone for attending. This concludes our program. Thanks, Rebecca.
Thanks.